Hi everyone, I'm Jack Rambling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. I'd like to share a few thoughts on The Melancholy of Resistance by Krasznahorkai László. This is a crucial novel. It's my favorite among the Krasznahorkai novels that I've read. I really think it's a masterpiece. I think it's a book in which Krasznahorkai fully developed his idea, his cosmology, his sense of philosophy of what is happening in our world and what its significance is. It's a very pessimistic book. It's a book that can feel absolutely brutal at times. It's very dense to read. There are no paragraph breaks on most of the pages, and the lines just run one after another, and they seem to almost tumble upon us. And yet, there is a crucial heart within this book. There's a few crucial beating hearts within this book that allow there to be this sense of hope, these glimmers of hope among the vast black expanse of our universe. I think this is a novel in which Krasznahorkai had viewed and surveyed the 20th century and looked at human history, and he saw chaos, he saw disorder, he saw cruelty. In the 20th century, the mechanization of evil and the way that human societies were perpetrating this evil upon others, upon their own small communities. And he views that as sort of this regressive sense of what our societies progress towards. We are not progressing towards a utopia, but rather we are progressing ever faster towards this return to this primordial chaos that is surrounding us. He draws on ideas and images that stretch across millennia of human myth and belief to craft this novel. And he gives this universal sense to this sense of this chaotic apocalypse that surrounds us, and an idea that this does not need to be a supernatural apocalypse. Rather, it can be one that when humans are left to our own devices, we will do this to each other. We will do this to ourselves. And he starts off right away on the first page. He illuminates these themes as he talks about a train. And he notes, to tell the truth, none of this really surprised anyone anymore, since rail travel, like everything else, was subject to the prevailing conditions. All normal expectations went by the board, and one's daily habits were disrupted by a sense of ever-spreading, all-consuming chaos, which rendered the future unpredictable, the past unrecallable, and ordinary life so haphazard that people simply assumed that whatever could be imagined might come to pass. That if there were only one door in a building, it would no longer open. That wheat would grow head downwards into the earth, not out of it. And that since no one could only note the symptoms of disintegration, the reasons for it remaining unfathomable and inconceivable, there was nothing anyone could do except to get a tenacious grip on anything that was still tangible. And that is sort of the thesis of this entire book. Everything is falling apart. Everything is tending towards this disorder. And it's an idea that he's going to weave in throughout the narrative and end with, ultimately, on the final page. And so because everything tends towards disorder, everyone in this small community is going to just grab onto whatever they can hold and stay there and hold fast to that, regardless of whatever the consequences might be, because it feels like their last grasp and their last connection to a community, even as that community is not necessarily healthy for them. We're in a small village on the border of Hungary, near the Carpathian Mountains. That's where there's a link to the railway there. And we have just this sense that almost no one in this village is happy, this community is happy. And a traveling circus arrives, and they have with them this enormous exhibit. And it's this enormous exhibit is sort of the first signifier of this idea that is going to permeate across the book, where we have a massive stuffed whale, this enormous stuffed whale. And it's advertised. One of the only page breaks in the novel has this full-page advertisement for the circus with this life-size whale that's been stuffed, and everybody wants to go see it. And there's rumors that as the circus has gone through other villages, they just leave absolute destruction in their wake. And the people who are in the village are kind of concerned. Wait, what is that? Why are they coming here next? What does that mean for us? There's not this sense that they would have ever gone to help another village that was being destroyed in the aftermath of this circus, or that they would ever go to see the whale somewhere else. It's just that they'll go see it when it comes to them. And so there are these really interesting ideas around what this whale means. And of course, the whale points towards the signifier of chaos from ancient myth with Leviathan, something that was a motif certainly for the Babylonians, for the Canaanites in the Hebrew Bible. We see it in Psalms and Job. And this idea that later on in later myths, we would see like the Midgard serpent that circles the earth in Norse myths. And so this signifier of chaos, that the whale is sort of being brought to them, and with the whale is going to come destruction, is going to come chaos, is going to come the massive stew that everything was once ordered from, but that everything will ultimately disintegrate into. And we're introduced to a couple of characters. We're introduced to characters who live in this town. We have Mr. and Mrs. Etzer, who don't live together. Mrs. Etzer is this individual who almost has Lady Macbeth vibes. She can see a path through and a path to power that others don't necessarily see. Her husband, Mr. Etzer, has found a certain solace in music, even though he seems to have abandoned that. He looks after this young man, Volushka, who in some sense has a Prince Mishkin quality from Dostoevsky's The Idiot. Darl from As I Lay Dying by Faulkner is another, I think, touchstone of this character who is perhaps not inhabiting the same reality as everyone else, doesn't seem to understand what everyone else understands, yet sees through and is able to grasp some truth, some true reality, some true heart beyond what is on the surface that everyone else sees and is preoccupied with. And so Volushka is there, and he's going to sort of be our eyes through the crucial middle of the novel. And we see Mrs. Plouffe, a neighbor, and she's sort of our first person we're introduced to, and will ultimately have sort of a tragic fate within the arrival of this circus. So we see these characters, we see their lives, but Krasznahorkai is really interested in sort of just giving us just enough of who these people are, so that after about 100 pages, once the circus is here in town and we see what's happening that night, as sort of chaos starts to brim and people start to arrive and things are changing, we get now these long monologues, these long periods of time in the consciousness of these various characters and how they're dealing with things. And crucially, Volushka is the one who goes and sees the director of the circus, who sort of terrifies everyone, is this giant. And there's this character who he's holding, this prince, who we never actually see full on. We hear his voice, we hear what he says, we see the effects of the prince's presence. We hear little descriptors about how he has to be carried. He can't walk on his own, or he seems very small, and different little things, but we never actually have a character see him and lay witness to what he looks like. And there's this sense that chaos is in the shadows around us. The prince is shouting, the factotum remarked indifferently above the now continuous, almost hysterical chirruping, not even bothering to address his boss directly. He says he is always free in himself. His position is between things, and in between things he sees that he is himself the sum of things, and what things add up to is ruin, nothing but ruin. To his followers he is the prince, but in his own view he is the prince of princes. Only he can see the whole, he says, because he can see there is no whole. And for the prince this is how things must be, as they must always be. He must see with his own eyes. His followers will wreak havoc because they understand his vision perfectly. His followers understand that all things are false pride, but don't know why. The prince knows. It is because the whole does not exist. The director cannot grasp this. The director is in his way. The prince is bored with him. He is going out. And there's something terrifying and sinister about that. And this is a refrain that various characters will sort of realize as the book progresses, is that if everything is tending towards disorder, as entropy and thermodynamics suggest, if everything is tending towards this destruction and falling apart, this return to the earliest of chaos, then what is the point of any action? What does any action do? Does it simply accelerate that disorder? Does it slow it down? It doesn't stop it. It doesn't prevent it. And that's this key idea across this book that Krasznahorkai is going to push forward, is how are the different characters going to deal with this realization? Are they going to take an action to attempt to slow chaos down? Are they going to accelerate it? Or are they going to try and find some venal, grasping, selfish goal to reach towards, even though they know it has no meaning in and of itself? And the prince explicates that, but it's left to other characters to then decide what they will do. And Volushka is the one who hears that, and he sort of thinks through what all of this means. And his realization of it ends up being a little more selfless. He notes the prince did exist, and that made it impossible to take a rational view of anything, since he required neither the quack mysticism of announcing himself as a celestial messenger, nor the operation of some inhuman desire to work harm in order to alter the shape of the world around him. His mere existence was enough to force it to abandon its habit of judging things by its own standards, and encourage it to believe that there were principles at work here that negated its desire to label him as an unequivocal fraud. At the same time, the phenomenon of his mere existence, Volushka continued meandering, included elements both of quack mysticism and human desire, as well as fraud, fury, and harm. Elements he did not bother to mask in the course of his haughty encounter with the director. The elements did not, however, constitute the person, but were simply the likely consequence of his clearly extraordinary and terrifying being, the full hidden significance and scope of which, apart from what could be concluded from a single stray remark, naturally lay beyond Volushka's comprehension. He has sort of, of all of our characters, he's the one who comes closest to the prince, to this magnetic character who weaves this sense of fear and destruction and sort of opens everyone's eyes to see that there is a pointlessness to their order and to their society and to their resistance to this temptation of to just let everything go. And Volushka, while being the one character who comes closest to the prince and deals most closely with him, and he hears like the pronouncements from him and has a sense of that charisma, is also the one who will take the most significant actions to resist it, to try and find a sense of identity, to question, to continue questioning the prince, to continue questioning this philosophy of nihilism and chaos. And so that, I think, is part of what gives this book its heart. We also see through Volushka and the character who we see sort of caring the most, we then see Mr. Edster and the care he has for Volushka, and that imputes almost this sense of humanity and into Mr. Edster, even despite his failures and despite the fact that earlier he had sort of given up on everything and is a symbol of those who have allowed this world to progress towards this falling apart. Because he hasn't bolstered it in any way, despite perhaps being qualified to and someone who could have been a leader or a genius or an artist within his community. He's abandoned all of that, and yet we find the way that he retains a sense of humanity. And he's thinking through, having sort of tried to nail boards and realized that he's only just figured out how to nail successfully without bashing his hand at the very end of nailing all these boards in. He starts thinking about these things, and he notes that self which by wandering through the labyrinth of its own nature leaves behind confused memorials which bear witness both to invitation and to withdrawal. And that's how it will be, contemplated Esther as he rambled on. The intangible contents of the world that arises out of this dialogue, which is itself so resistant to interpretation and which raises the insoluble question of what, after all, is the point, act as a warning to the insatiable, a net to catch infinity, a language to capture that which is brilliant, and that is how one becomes two, the thing itself and its significance. That significance, like a hand, would first trace, then gather up the apparently stray threads of this mysterious mixture, would hold them together like mortar in a brick wall. But, and here he smiled, feeling the radiant heat of the fire as he approached it, even if this hand, much like his own, were to release the strands, this dialogue of opposing forces would go on. Nor would the wall collapse. It would not collapse just as he himself would not collapse. But he had to let go of all he had once clung on to, for this was a vital part of the process of simple realization. The realization that knowledge led either to wholesale illusion or to irrational depression. And he wants to liberate himself from this self-referential questioning, is how it's described. And so that sense of Esther, this man who has abandoned everything, and then he starts to cling back to pieces, realizes he wants to stop clinging to aspects of his identity, aspects of his life, and yet what he clings to is this care for Volushka, this concern for a man who has helped him in the past, who he finds a sense of, he has decided he's going to care, and is going to be, beaten and questioned and treated very poorly as he tries to find out what happened to the one person I cared about. What was his fate? Is he still alive? Let me go find him. Let me try and say something to protect him from these forces. Because as the forces of disorder have descended on this town and burst everything apart, we see the revanche forces of order that arrive, symbolized in many details by Mrs. Edster. Well, Mr. Edster finds this selflessness in looking after Volushka and wanting to be concerned for his fate. Mrs. Edster, on the other hand, becomes to symbolize the reactionary forces of order. And in a sense, Krasznahorkai notes that if everything is tending towards disorder, we see that there have been these forces of order, but it's become totalitarian forces in the 20th century. And those are equally terrifying. Those are just as terrifying as the forces of disorder. And Mrs. Edster symbolizes that, the way that she seems to successfully want to change things within her community, and yet it's not out of concern for the community. It's this selfish concern. And And with that, she then is making an alliance with the military forces that are coming in and who are clearly just going to be executing people or imprisoning people. They bring their own version of the Leviathan, their own version of the whale. And Krasznahorkai, to his credit, makes it fairly unsubtle that, you know, the whale is met with a tank. And there's only one tank, just as there's only one whale. And that, you know, this pair of Leviathans colliding give us the sense that each of these is two sides of the same coin, that neither of these is a beneficial force, neither of these is looking to help anyone. And so there's a character who thinks, there's a war going on out there, and it's only worth waking to the dying night if you are prepared to be utterly ruthless. A war, he kept scanning the rooftops, where everything is engaged in a conflict that has no rules. A war in which one side must continually besiege the other, in which to aim at anything but victory was pointless. It was a struggle, in which the only power to remain standing was that which looked for no reasons, which was content to accept that the whole thing should remain without an explanation because, and here he remembered the prince's advice, it simply didn't exist. In thinking this, he fully acknowledged for the first time the justice of Mr. Esther's contention that chaos really was the natural condition of the world. And this being eternally the case, you simply couldn't begin to predict the course of events, which is what Krasznahorkai had said at the very beginning. And it's Volushka who has this realization. It's not even worth trying, thought Volushka, and wiggling his aching toes inside his cold boots. It's as pointless to predict as to judge, since even the words chaos and outcome are entirely redundant, there being nothing one can posit as their antitheses, which further implies that the very act of naming is enough to put paid to them, for there is simply one damn thing after another. And this hopelessness that he finds, and then this urge that Volushka has even after that epiphany of disorder and apocalypse to flee and to try and preserve a sense of life, despite all of this, is quite extraordinary, I think. In the final pages, we see everyone's fate, which I won't spoil. We see, you know, whether it's order or chaos that triumph. And Krasznahorkai makes it very clear as he goes into this almost chemical description of what happens when bonds fall apart, what happens when a body dies and starts to decay, and the cells, you know, go through autolysis. What happens with the paper itself that this book is printed on? How is it going to fall apart? He goes into those ideas and really examines what is this natural state. And yes, it's a very, very dark vision, but also there's a heart at the center of it, within these human characters. And Krasznahorkai never fully answers for each of them. You know, despite their fates, do they find a sense of peace? Do they find a sense of purpose in their choices? So I think it's an incredible novel. It was ably translated by George Szirtes, who's done several others for New Directions Publishing, and highly recommend it. Certainly Satan Tango is another crucial book. I'll link my discussion on this in the description box. War and War follows those up. And this one is a little less overtly apocalyptic in terms of a community, the way Satan Tango and Melancholy Resistance were. But it has its own sort of divergence that I think is worth exploring. And I'll be looking forward to reading Baron Wenckheim's Holiday, in part because of how there's the Wenckheim Avenue within Melancholy Resistance. I think there's a crucial sense of Nietzsche who comes through in Krasznahorkai's writing, whether it's Beyond Good and Evil or on the Genealogy of Morals. I think those both have a presence in this book. If you're interested in reading about sort of very old conceptions of chaos, the creation myth from Mesopotamia, the Babylonian creation myth with Marduk and Tiamat, and the way that Tiamat is described, I think is very relevant to what's happening with the whale and the symbology between the whale and the tank as twin leviathans within the Melancholy Resistance. And that can be found in a couple of different translations. There's a way in which this book recalls Dead Souls and the idea of sort of the stranger who comes to town, the city that's sort of thrown into disorder. I think Gogol had a clearer sense of humor and was not quite as brutally nihilistic as what Krasznahorkai presents in this book, but they're comparable. I had mentioned Darl from As I Lay Dying. I think he's another very clear reference point with what we see with Volushka. The trilogy from Samuel Beckett, I think, is very close, perhaps Waiting for Godot as well. Here, Godot certainly does arrive, but Beckett's philosophies, I think, are fairly close. Equally, The Master and Margarita by Bulgakov. Again, this is a more like outrageously funny book, and there are sort of this sense of humor that's a little more blatant and less subtle than what Krasznahorkai does, but I think the philosophies, the worldviews are pretty close. I'd mentioned, of course, the prince, the titular idiot in Dostoevsky's novel as someone who I was reminded of. Another apocalyptic work would be The Man Who Lived Underground by Richard Wright. I was thinking as well of the film Dawn of the Dead, the way we have characters who are sort of trapped as there's forces of danger and disorder and moving around them and harming, truly dangerous towards them in the way that they are trapped in the mall, and this critique of consumerism and materialism while also showing the bonds that can exist within a small group when they're under siege in a sense. Certainly a reference to Leviathan couldn't be unmentioned to mention Melville's Moby-Dick, or works like Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy. I think the judge in particular would feel of a piece with a number of characters in this book. He wrote in Hungarian, though he had lived in parts of Croatia and other modern Croatia and Austria-Hungary, would be Czath Géza, whose stories are somewhat fantastic and surreal, not unlike what Krasznahorkai is doing in his work. Another apocalyptic work would be both Miss Lonely Hearts and The Day of the Locust. In this case, I think it was The Day of the Locust by Nathanael, where we see the community that is nearing its end rather than just an individual. Unforgiving Years by Victor Serge, probably the second of the four parts of this, is closest to what Krasznahorkai is doing. Equally, in terms of the writing, Soul by Andrey Platonov. And then finally, there's huge references to 1984 by George Orwell. I think they're very close to what we see here, and in particular, sort of the totalitarian response to the chaos. And finally, Nádas Péter's Parallel Stories, his own view of sort of the 20th century, a survey of the hypocrisy, the violence, the cruelty, the passion that underlay, and the ideas that underlay so many different individuals and events across that century. So that was Melancholy of Resistance. I hope everyone's doing well. Thank you.